In the dark silence of medieval cellars, in the smoke of village kitchens, and in vessels carefully buried in the ground, a struggle took place that determined more than just tastes. It decided survival. In the Middle Ages, food preservation was not a luxury or a mere customary craft, but a necessity that determined whether people would survive winter, drought, crop failures, or military campaigns. In a world without refrigerators and electric freezers, it was necessary to rely on reason, experience, and the power of natural forces. It's no wonder that every available method of preservation has been fine-tuned over the centuries, not only for nutritional preservation purposes, but also for taste, aroma, and texture. While the farmer was putting the grain into sacks in his barn, the fisherman in the north was hanging cod in the freezing wind, and the monastery cook was layering cabbage in an oak barrel. Each of them knew that it was these actions that decided whether they would still enjoy a full table in March or chew the last crust of bread. And it is this world, in which food gained its value through hard work and ingenuity, that we will show you today in all its breadth. When the sun was still warm with its summer heat, the rustling of slabs could be heard in the countryside, on which slices of fruit, bunches of herbs, and pieces of meat were spread. Drying was one of the oldest and most proven ways to extend the shelf life of food. It was not just about the simplicity of the method, but about its availability. All it took was warmth, time, and enough space. In warmer regions, direct sunlight was widely used, while in colder regions, people had to put their hand to work and build drying rooms over the fire. They were not only dried, but often slightly smoked, which gave the food a more interesting aroma and longer endurance. Fish, especially in northern Europe, formed a separate chapter. Cod hanging in the wind turned into hard stockfish, which lasted for years and was so valuable that it even served as currency. Meat was dried in thin strips, hung in the attic, while herbs decorated the kitchen ceilings of the poor and the rich. In some areas, food drying developed to the level of a small industry. For example, dried mushrooms formed the basis of fasting meals, while dried fruit turned into a delicacy, accessible especially to the wealthier classes. Salt in the Middle Ages wasn't just a spice, it was power. It was not for nothing that it was called white gold. She was able to stop time in both meat and fish, and thus became the key to survival. During the pig slaughtering, it was not possible to eat everything fresh, so the salting method came into play. Pieces of meat were rubbed with salt and placed in layers in barrels or pots, where the salt drew moisture out of them. This created a salty environment in which bacteria stopped thriving. The result was meat that could last a whole year, something completely unimaginable without this simple ingredient. Salted herring barrels were the basis of trade throughout northern Europe. Herring, it was said, was the silver of the sea. On days of strict fasting, when it was forbidden to eat meat, salted fish became an irreplaceable part of the diet. At the such time, the finer and purer the salt, the greater the luxury. The rich ate under salt, while the poor ate under salt. The differences were shown not only in taste, but also in quality of life. In the Middle Ages, wood smoke became another powerful ally in the fight against food spoilage. Smoking not only dried out the meat, but also coated it with a layer of substances that prevented the growth of mold and bacteria. In addition, the smoke gave the meat an unmistakable taste that persists in kitchens to this day. In the countryside, people often smoked directly in their kitchens. They hung meat over a fire and left it in smoke for several days. Independent smokehouses were established in towns and estates, where more advanced methods were developed, from hot to cold smoking. Not only meat was put into the smokehouses, fish, sausages, and even cheese were often exposed to smoke, and each county had its own recipes and preferred types of wood. Hungarian butchers added juniper, while in Italy, they paid attention to finer fruit wood. When the smokehouse opened and black ham or hard sausage came out, it was proof of work, patience, and skill that could save the whole family from winter hunger. Fermentation is perhaps the most interesting of the preservation methods, because it does not stop, but rather supports the activity of microorganisms in a controlled way. This creates foods that not only last, but are also good for your health. Sauerkraut, pickled cucumbers, onions, beets, all this has become a pillar of the winter diet of many Europeans. All it took was a little salt, a wooden barrel, and patience. The result was a nutritious, crunchy, and acidic dish packed with vitamins that helped you survive for months without fresh vegetables. In addition to vegetables, beverages were also fermented: beer, wine, cider, and mead. It wasn't just about the joy of alcohol. fermented beverages were safer than water, which was often contaminated. The monks brewed beer on a large scale, not only for their own use, but also as a charity for the poor and pilgrims. Milk quickly turned into cheese and curd, which could last for weeks or months. Fermentation was not just about preservation, it was a path to health and culture. Where salt or fermentation alone was not enough, it was time to marinate in vinegar. This method was popular mainly in cities, monasteries, and bourgeois kitchens, where the availability of spices, vinegar, and ceramics for storage was higher than in the countryside. The principle was simple. Vegetables, often briefly boiled, were placed in a container and poured over with a hot infusion of vinegar, water, salt, and herbs. After cooling, the container was closed and the food was protected from spoiling microbes. The result was tasty and durable pickles, sharp, sour, crunchy. Pickled cucumbers, onions, carrots, or mixed vegetables were served as a side dish, adding zest and nutrients to the dishes during the cold months. Vinegar, made from wine or beer, was a common part of the monastery's supplies, and thanks to it, even ordinary vegetables were turned into a delicacy. The combination with salt, sugar, and spices created different variants, sometimes sweet and sour, sometimes very hot. These infusions brought variety to the diet, and people loved them in the Middle Ages as much as we do today. Wine, beer, cider, but also mead. All these were not only sources of pleasure in the Middle Ages, but also a way to preserve energy and nutrients from fruit or grain for a longer period of time. Alcohol was produced by fermenting sugars, and because it had disinfectant effects, it was considered safer than ordinary water. Wine and mead lasted for months, while beer had to be drunk within a few weeks, which is why it was brewed almost constantly. The monks were masters of this art, and their monasteries were often transformed into small breweries. Beer has literally become liquid bread. In monasteries like Westminster in England, up to 1 gallon of beer per monk was consumed per day, not only as a drink, but as a staple of food. The fermentation of alcohol also helped to preserve the fruit in liquid form, so grapes, apples, or plums could also be used out of season. In addition, alcohol was also used for pickling, for example, to protect meat or fruit in jars. Milk was a problem in the Middle Ages. It spoiled very quickly. To prevent its destruction, it was necessary to transform it into something more durable as quickly as possible, and so cheese, cottage cheese, butter, and cream were created. Cheese production was one of the most efficient ways to preserve milk without losing nutritional value. Hard cheeses such as Parmesan, which have been produced in Italy since the 13th century, have lasted for years. In the countryside, rather soft and fresh cheeses were produced, but even these could be stored for several weeks in a cool cellar or sealed with fat. The cheeses were salted, left to ripen, and often coated in wax or stored in wells and cold pits. Butter was pressed into molds and stored in clay pots. All these dairy products were not only long-lasting, but also very nutritious. When stored properly, they formed an important part of the diet at a time when there was nothing fresh at hand. The fermentation of milk thus ensured not only livelihood, but also progress. A cheese-making tradition was born that persists to this day. One of the less conspicuous, but no less important methods of preservation was to water food with fat or honey. Thanks to its antiseptic properties, honey had the unique ability to prevent the growth of microorganisms, so fruit and meat were stored in it. Pickled plums, pears, or pieces of roast lasted in ceramic containers for many months. In addition, honey added flavor, and because sugar was an expensive imported luxury, honey remained a more affordable and common sweetener. Fat had a similar preservative ability. When the meat was slowly cooked and then covered with its own ointment, a long-lasting delicacy called confit was created. The remains of baking or greaves were placed in clay pots, covered with a layer of lard, and stored in the cold. Food prepared in this way lasted for weeks. Even pâtés were coated with dough or fat to separate them from the air and stay fresh longer. Simple, yet effective. In times without electricity, winter was the greatest ally of preservation. In cold regions, the meat was simply hung outside, where it froze and remained unspoiled for weeks. Even more sophisticated were the ice pits, deep holes in the ground lined with straw, into which ice was brought from rivers or ponds in winter. This ice then cooled the food until summer. However, such storage required servants, space, and know-how, and so it remained the privilege of monasteries, castles, and richer estates. Cellars were much more common. Partially underground spaces with constant temperature and humidity served as natural refrigerators. Everything was stored there: barrels of beer, wine, bags of grain, vegetables, and fruit. Root vegetables were covered with sand. Apples were broken down into straw. Dairy products were stored in pottery that was lowered into wells or streams. In some cases, food was even buried in the ground: eggs with lime, meat in barrels. The medieval imagination really knew no boundaries. The ability to preserve food was not evenly distributed in the Middle Ages. Each social class had a different approach to methods, tools, and the raw materials themselves. Country cottages had only limited options: a simple cellar, a few barrels of cabbage, a few smoked sausages hanging in the black kitchen. Storing grain and legumes in the attic was often barely enough until spring. As a result, many poor peasants experienced hunger at the end of winter when their supplies ran out. For them, food preservation was a daily struggle, not a certainty. On the contrary, monasteries became models of organization and efficiency. The monks managed to use all available methods. They dried fruit, salted fish, smoked to save meat, brewed beer, and cabbage layered in barrels filled their cellars. Their records of cooking procedures and methods of preserving food have often survived to this day. Castles and estates were supplied for long months, not only for normal operation, but also in case of siege. The cellars concealed barrels of meat, sacks of grain, and ice houses full of winter ice. The castle ponds functioned as living reservoirs. Carp or pike were bred on site and caught as needed. The way people stored food also varied according to climate, local traditions, and available ingredients. In southern Europe, the sun was used the most. Fruit, tomatoes, herbs, and fish were dried. The heat and dry air allowed for natural preservation. In addition, olive oil played a crucial role here, protecting food as well as lard in the north. Dried tomatoes or olives pickled in oil have become typical Mediterranean products that have lasted the whole season. Northern Europe, on the other hand, benefited from the cold. Frost made it possible to freeze meat and fish, which could then be stored without further treatment. Fermentation played a greater role here. Sauerkraut, pickles, and fish were an integral part of the diet. Eastern Europe excelled in combining both approaches. Smoke, salt, and frost combined into unique techniques. And Central Europe, i.e., the area of today's Czech Republic, Poland, or Austria, has become the domain of smoke and salt. Smoked meat, salted bacon, and barrels of cabbage were a common part of the farm. Conservation wasn't just a technique, it was part of everyday culture. To preserve food meant to survive, but also to create a supply for holidays, fasts, celebrations, and gifts. Smoked hams hanging in cellars were not just food, they were a symbol of wealth and skill. Barrels of cabbage and herring at markets formed the basis of trade routes, influencing taxes, exchanges, and culinary customs. Without these methods, neither modern cuisine nor today's food industry would have come into existence. The legacy of medieval preservation methods lives on, in a jar of jam, in a sausage from the smokehouse, in a jar of pickles. Whether we look at dried herbs, hard cheeses, fermented drinks, or sausages, each of these products carries a piece of skill, ingenuity, and resilience of our ancestors. The Middle Ages taught us that if you know how, you can preserve not only taste, but also life. The everyday life of medieval man was marked by careful planning, thriftiness, and thinking ahead. Food was not a matter of course. Every slice of bread, every piece of meat had to be obtained, processed, and preserved with the utmost care. Peasants protected their meager supplies as if they were treasures. A barrel of sauerkraut, a few pots of lard, hanging bunches of herbs or dried fruit were the difference between a comfortable wintering and cruel hunger. Yet even in these modest conditions, creativity was born. Housewives dried apples on the stove, hid butter in wells, wrapped pots with cottage cheese in wet clay, or buried them in cold soil. Customs passed down from generation to generation were not just a tradition. They were the result of hundreds of years of experimentation and adaptation to nature. Each region had its own gadgets, and people had to rely on what they had at hand: clay, salt, fire, wind, smoke, or frost. Medieval methods of preserving food were not only a means of survival, but also became a formative force for the taste habits and gastronomy of the whole of Europe. This has given rise to dishes that have lasted for centuries: smoked ham, sauerkraut, salted fish, dried fruit, preserves, cheese, fermented drinks. These tastes are not accidental, but have arisen out of necessity and have been transformed into tradition. And it is the traditions that have given European cuisine its diversity and uniqueness. The influence of these methods is still evident today. Drying herbs, preserving marmalades, smoking meat at the cottage, fermenting vegetables in jars, all these are direct descendants of medieval techniques. In times of abundance, we may not realize how revolutionary it was to be able to extend the life of an ordinary cucumber or piece of meat for months. At that time, it was the difference between life and death. Today we find taste, history, and respect for the past in it. Experience has become the currency of survival. People in the Middle Ages could not afford to waste time, food, or energy. Each method of preserving food had its advantages, but also its risks. Carelessly salted meat could become moldy, poorly fermented vegetables could spoil, and unprotected supplies could become prey to rodents or thieves. Therefore, conservation was both an art and a science. Each region, each household gradually created its own system and habits that were based on observation, trial, and error. And it was this practice that carried a quiet but powerful wisdom. In harmony with nature and in respect for resources, the key to longevity and self-sufficiency is hidden. Preserving food was not only about preserving matter, but also about preserving ideas. How to live modestly, sustainably, and with the knowledge that nothing must be wasted. Today, when we open a jar of pickles, pour dried herbs into tea, or treat ourselves to a slice of ripe cheese, few people realize that we are touching a 1,000-year-old tradition. Food preservation in the Middle Ages was not just survival. It was a path to stability, community, and the joy of ordinary things. Every barrel of cabbage, every carefully smoked sausage or salted cod brought more than nourishment. It brought peace, security, and faith that winter will come to an end. And so, even though we have modern refrigerators and jars today, there is still a deep respect for these old methods rooted in us. Not because we need them urgently, but because memory lives in them. The memory of humanity, which has learned to resist destruction in the most natural way, through creativity, perseverance, and respect for every piece of food. In medieval Europe, food preservation was not limited to households and estates. It also had a huge economic impact. Canned food has become an important trade item. Herring in barrels, dried cod, smoked meats, wine, or pickled vegetables were transported long distances, changed hands at markets, and even served as currency. Herring was considered so valuable that in some areas it replaced silver. Thus, preservation made it possible to trade food that would otherwise spoil very quickly. Hanseatic cities, monasteries, and aristocratic estates built their wealth on the ability to store and sell non-perishable food. Even inland cities could get fish from the sea, meat from other regions, or fruit out of season. Breweries, drying rooms, smokehouses, and herring workshops became not only part of the city's infrastructure, but also a source of job opportunities and the development of crafts. We must not forget the spiritual dimension. Food preservation played a key role in the strict fasting regime of Christian Europe. The Church has set many days a year when meat, dairy products, and often eggs are not allowed to be eaten. To ensure sufficient food during the fasting periods, it was necessary to have substitutes ready, especially fish, legumes, cabbage, fermented vegetables, or dried fruit. Salted fish, such as herring or cod, has literally become the basis of Lenten cuisine. Monasteries were a model in this respect. The monks not only observed fasts, but also developed procedures to indulge in a varied and nutritious diet even during these periods. They came up with recipes for pâtés made from legumes, fermented porridge, baked vegetables, or salted fish with sweet and sour sauce. Thus, the preservation of food not only meant surviving the winter, but also made it possible to observe religious regulations without endangering health. Whether you're drying herbs at home, preserving jam, or storing apples in the cellar, you're unconsciously following a millennia-old line of ancestors who knew that preserving food meant preserving life. Their heritage is not only in the recipes, but also in the mindset, to appreciate every bite, to plan, to create, to think ahead. Thank you for walking this journey through time with me. Leave like and subscribe. Thank you.